reading Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith. And I was nodding along with the criticisms of religion. And then I got to the bits where he started talking about American foreign policy and even torture and saying that Islam was this big threat. And I had Muslim friends. And I thought, have I skipped a chapter here? I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I got the feeling that I was missing the fine print. What I eventually came to understand is that I was being encouraged to see myself in a different way too. Muslim people were being cast as this pre-modern threat, and at the same time, I was being offered the role of the rational, intelligent, suspicious, cautious, hard-nosed, really facing up to the tough problems, asking the tough questions. Really, I'm brave for saying it. I'm defending the legacy of the Enlightenment that my country embodies, the legacy that I am the heiress to. I am. Yes, people were afraid. But why did their fear take the form it did and have the effects that it did? Islamophobia didn't just start in 2001. The anti-racism think tank Runnymede Trust published a report titled Islamophobia, a Problem for Us All in 1997. They followed it in 2017 with the hilariously understated sequel, Islamophobia, Still a Problem for Us All. The philosopher Sarah Ahmed says that emotions are more than just individual psychological states. Society produces and prioritizes certain group emotional responses over others, and in doing so, reveals interesting things. Now that's quite an abstract point, so let me give you an example. Story time again. On Monday, the 25th of July, 2005, 4 men were renting a cottage in Haworth, West Yorkshire. They had driven up from London for a friend's wedding, and about 11:20 a.m. one of them went out to buy laundry detergent, whereupon several armed police jumped out and pinned him to the pavement at gunpoint, along with another man who just happened to be walking past. The police searched the house and the car with dogs, interrogated the men, and quickly discovered absolutno ničega. They were completely innocent. What had happened was a local resident had seen 4 men, 3 South Asian, 1 white, drive up on a Sunday night with a suspicious package and go into the house. And they'd called the cops, who responded thusly. The suspicious package turned out to be a box of mangoes, delightfully, and one of the men had recently been giving lectures at Bradford University on the need for community cohesion. It's 1 a.m. and you're going through some guy's bins, reading his receipts, and you know the only thing he's done wrong is visit a mosque, and it's not exactly James Bond, is it?
The war on terror is like this game, right? We've built this entire apparatus and convinced the world that there's a terrorist in every mosque and that every newly arrived Muslim immigrant is secretly anti-American. And because we've promoted that false notion, we have to validate it. So we catch some kid who doesn't know his ear from his ass for building a bomb fed to them by the FBI. It becomes a vicious circle, because the longer you look at a kid, the bigger the file gets, even if they've done nothing. And then 6 months later, somebody calls the FBI and says, I've seen some suspicious activity in this neighborhood, and an agent can see that we have thick files on all of these kids. But the question is, okay, so you have thick files on these kids, but the files have shown that these kids are guilty of nothing. So what does that actually achieve? It achieves intelligence, and that's a nebulous, wonderful sounding word that everyone likes to throw around. But based on my experience, the entire purpose of these assessments was to create a database of American Muslims. It's a very dangerous and toxic environment, and we haven't come to terms with the fact that maybe we really screwed up here. Maybe what we're doing is wrong.
The essence of what occurred here is that a government, understandably zealous to protect its citizens from terrorism, came upon a man both bigoted and suggestible, one who was incapable of committing an act of terrorism on his own. It created acts of terrorism out of his fantasies of bravado and bigotry, and then made these fantasies come true. The government did not have to infiltrate and foil some nefarious plot. There was no nefarious plot to foil. Only the government could have made a terrorist out of Mr. Cromarty, a man whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean in its scope. I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that there would have been no crime here except the government instigated it, planned it, and brought it to fruition.
A judge and an FBI agent. And when they're the ones saying that something's gone wrong, the entrapment defense fails almost every time, as indeed it failed in United States v. Cromartie when all 4 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to 25 years, as several political analysts have said. And these rancid vibes contributed to an atmosphere in which Muslim people were seen as potentially disloyal, suspicious, maybe even dangerous, and in need of surveillance. Reminds me an awful lot of the Cold War. Muslims, disproportionately women, were attacked in the streets, monstered in the media. Many were forced into violent relationships with the state or put under pointless surveillance. A lot of people who weren't even Muslim got a hard time just because people thought that they were Muslim. And a large number of hypocritical and simplistic stereotypes about Muslims were disseminated widely.
The Islamic world never had a secular enlightenment, which is why they have such a disposition towards violence. Unlike Great Britain, a peaceful society that's never been violent towards anyone.
When Algeria was fighting for its independence from France, the French justified their occupation in part by claiming that Muslim women were uniquely very oppressed, in particular oppressed by wearing veils, which the colonial government banned. France banned Muslim women from wearing veils again in national territory in 2004, claiming it was for their own good. And a lot of Muslim women have objected to this pretty colonialist idea that inside every Muslim woman there's a non-Muslim woman struggling to get out. Or the idea that Muslim women aren't aware of patriarchy and aren't capable of challenging it from within their own intellectual traditions.
The body of the Muslim woman, a body fixed in the Western imaginary as confined, mutilated, and sometimes murdered in the name of culture, serves to reinforce the threat that the Muslim man is said to pose to the West, and is used to justify the extraordinary measures of violence and surveillance required to discipline him and Muslim communities.
I have to defer to the evidence, which shows that anti-Muslim attitudes frequently talk, walk, and quack a hell of a lot like racism. In this ABC article from 2015, sociologist Rhonda Abdel Fattah talks to several Australian people who were upset when their local supermarkets started stocking halal food. In particular, they seemed distressed and disoriented when their favourite products started carrying halal labels, as if that meant they weren't allowed to enjoy them anymore. Abdel Fattah says these people were so used to thinking of that space as for them, so used to thinking of the food on the shelves as theirs, even before they paid for it, that they perceived the presence of another perspective as a threat of potential takeover. Replacement by racial minorities has long been a nightmare in the brains of far-right racists, and Islamophobia dovetails very neatly into that. Scholar Shireen Razak says that this is clearly racial thinking. Sometimes it's full-blown racism, but often it's broader than that. It's thinking that people can be divided into essential groups based on what they look like or where their ancestors came from, and then supposing that one group of people are inherently just a bigger threat than the others, which often implicitly justifies the arbitrary surveillance and violence that they're subjected to. It's worth noting that Islamophobia is often sold as being defensive, whether it's surveillance in the US and UK, or internment camps in China, or conspiracy theories in India, or the Big G from 1995. Not GoldenEye, the thing that you can't say out loud on YouTube without getting demonetized. After 9/11, counterterrorism strategy had a real crisis. Because instead of investigating crimes that we actually have evidence for, security services started introducing preemptive measures to tackle crimes that might happen. That's why agents like Terry Albury ended up spying on people who overwhelmingly never did anything wrong. The trouble is that what might happen is infinite. Aliens might invade tomorrow. We might find out that we're living in a simulation or that sexy communists have infiltrated your government. There's zero evidence for any of that. But there was also zero evidence that James Crumity was breaking the law. Until somebody decided to make that evidence. Part of the problem was that after 9/11 and 7/7 in the West, people obviously wanted to know why these traumatic things had happened, but the explanations often weren't very good. In analyzing post-9/11 media, immediate aftermath, there was a strong push to say something, even if it wasn't particularly edifying or coherent. The list of things that were politically acceptable to say quickly proved to be quite short. You were allowed to say that terrorists hate our freedoms, that they are evil/mad, and you were allowed to blame it on religion. Free speech! But if you talked about the disenfranchisement and the aggressive foreign policy and the racism that alienates many people from society and motivates a tiny number to commit terrible violence, if you said that a heavy-handed response was likely to give ammo to the worst people on both sides of that response. In other words, if you looked at terrorism the way academics do, as a mode of political expression, however unjustifiable and horrific, you could quickly find yourself on the receiving end of a nasty backlash.
Answers to the questions of what drives this process are to exclude ascribing any causative role to the actions of Western governments or their allies in other parts of the world. Instead, individual psychological or theological journeys, largely removed from social and political circumstances, are claimed to be the root of the cause of the radicalization process. While some accounts acknowledge politics as a component, using euphemistic phrases such as grievances against real or perceived injustices, this is only ever done in the face of overwhelming empirical evidence before they quickly move on to the more comfortable ground of psychology or theology. How a government makes sense of political violence directed against it usually tells us at least as much about the nature of that government as it does about the nature of its violent opponents.
Rather than spend money tackling the political and economic causes of disenfranchisement that leads some people to feel like criminal violence is their only option, huge amounts of resources get plowed into surveillance and war. Islamophobia supplies a particular understanding of threat, and so it fills a political vacuum at a time when real explanations and answers are simply nieżelatelnie.